Palace of Mirrors, Season 1, Episode 5, Marialla. Darien tried not to stare straight into Marialla's eyes, but he might as well have been standing in a winter storm, trying not to touch the snow. He had never seen eyes like hers, violet sparks against a vivid blue. They struck him, not just because of their color, but because they cut through him in a way that almost made him feel like a child who had been caught pilfering cookies from a baking tray. The Reynolds had welcomed him warmly when he rode up. Her father, Keith, had stepped up from out of their barn and offered him a hand almost as soon as Darien had gotten unsteadily down from his horse. "Put her there," he said with a wide grin on his face. He took Darien's hand and nearly squeezed it right off his wrist. "How's your father doing? It's been far too long since I saw him. What about your sisters? Did you make it through the winter all right?" Darien swallowed and told him about Kathy. The words still felt wrong in his mouth, like words that belonged to some other Darien from some other farm. His Kathy couldn't really be gone, could she? Before he could go too far down the trail of those thoughts, Marialla and her mother appeared. They drove an old electric wagon piled high with apples, the fruit still covered by a protective layer of bark. Marialla was not a character from one of Kathy's stories, with hair the color of midnight and a face with enough symmetry to make a mathematician blush. But she had those eyes. They were sharp enough to bring a blush to his face, and soft enough to make him smile. They fit perfectly against the dark hue of her skin. She laughed, not unkindly, when she caught him staring, and he could only blush further and look away. "Mari, you shouldn't tease the boy," her mother playfully slapped her daughter on the shoulder. Marialla's mother was more than comfortably plump, but there was something hard about her. She had a rough voice with smooth edges. Her hands moved constantly when she spoke. They were rough hands. They were hands that had never known a day of rest. "But Mama, you and Dad are no fun to tease. You know all my tricks already. It's not every day I get fresh blood." She winked at Darien, and he found that, in fact, he could blush yet more. The family continued to chat while Darien stood there, awkwardly trying to figure out when he should say something and what he should say. By the evening, he almost thought he had his place in the conversation figured out, and he could nearly meet Marialla's gaze without blushing. She seemed to have a way of catching his eye at the most inopportune moment. Like just as he was explaining how the farm work was going to her father, inevitably he began to sputter, and his words trailed into mishmash, and everyone laughed uproariously. Sitting outside around a table, Darien studied her father as he set out a meal. Thick glasses perched on the end of a long nose. In another time or another place, he might have been considered bookish, but his face showed the lines season after season had written with wind and ice. He wore a wry smile most of the time, especially when his daughter once again had Darien at a loss. Smoke rose from a fire pit, grease from the meat still sizzling in the coals. Darien held a piece up and paused for a moment before putting it in his mouth. It had been years since he'd eaten meat. The texture alarmed him, but the rich flavor sent shivers down his spine. No families anywhere near his farm raised animals. On a world where many farms struggled to grow enough food to make it through winter, there was nothing left for feed. Marialla's family hadn't raised the birds themselves, but they controlled a valuable resource. Her father explained that their orchard was one of the last remaining sources of fruit left on Six. In the days of the Empire, a vast trade network had supplied the small moon with a variety of goods, including fruit. Most of the farms, orchards, and other agricultural sources on Six dated from before the Empire conquered the moon, and they had atrophied during the imperial reign. It had simply been easier to buy the necessary goods than to grow them in an environment that, even back then, had not been conducive to growth. Darien looked out over the orchard, but found his eyes wandering to the broken towers rising up against clouds smoldering with the never-seen setting sun. "What's it like living so close to those ruins?" Marialla's mother, Alani, shrugged. You know, I've never thought about them much. I grew up here, and the ruins were just always there, like the mountains or the ravines. She smiled and continued. Now, your mother and aunt, when they visited as girls, they always went off exploring those ruins, no matter how many times they were told to stay away. Your mother, Sandy, she was something else. She used to tell us these stories at night when we were supposed to be sleeping. She would tell them, and they would just take your breath away. It was like she was lifting back some veil and showing you something you'd always known, but never really seen. Keith set down his fork and looked up. For a moment his glasses reflected the towers. What you see there is only a part of it. There are tunnels that stretch for miles, even way out past the buildings. And to be honest, they're a nuisance as much as anything. If I had a roast bird for every time the ground has opened up and tried to swallow me, this wouldn't be a very fancy meal. Marialla pinned Darien under her gaze. He could only stare and wait for her to speak. I feel like the ruins mean something to you. Darien looked down, anything to look away from her eyes so he could actually breathe. Still, he felt them, and he knew in that moment that her eyes had the weight of stars. How many times had he lain beneath the clouds, his eyes closed too tight, praying to the palace, to the spirits of his ancestors, to anything that would listen. Just praying that he could feel the stars on his skin. Surely no clouds could cover so much light, so much weight. All the same, the closest he ever came was the falling snow melting against his skin. I don't know. I mean, yes, they mean something to me. But I don't know what. Kathy used to tell me those stories, the ones my mom told, and I used to believe them. I used to believe them all, and then I didn't. But now I'm here and I'm looking at these ruins, and it's almost like looking at her stories, and they're real. They're right there. Marialla smiled at him, and Darien felt a warm wave wash over him. He would give a lot to see that smile, he realized. It's funny. I never had much patience for stories. I like my feet on solid ground. The words broke something in Darien. For a moment he only heard his father's voice, and then suddenly words were tumbling out of his mouth, and he found he couldn't stop them. I never understand when someone says something like that. Solid ground? There's so much more out there, so many more possibilities, and we gave it all up. For what? Now we're nothing but a bunch of starving farmers forever digging in the dirt. We live to survive. We survive and we survive, and nothing, not a palace damned thing, ever changes. How can you look at those buildings? Buildings that mean that... At last he regained control over his mouth. Too late, far too late. Everyone stared at him. His throat felt raw, his face hot, his eyes stinging. The apple trees whispered on the hill. He held his breath tight in his chest, as tight as he'd ever held Kathy's stories. In that breath he held everything he had ever wanted from the world. It burned in his chest, too great a thing for a young man to hold. Buildings that mean what? Marialla's face had lost its smile, but she didn't look at him with concern. Only curiosity looked out from her eyes. They held the promise of spring in their violet hue. When she spoke, there was nothing Darien could do but answer. This time, he didn't look away. He met her gaze straight on when he spoke. Those buildings, they mean we can do more. We can be more. They mean that dreams and stories don't just have to be words. They can amount to something real. The sky darkened to purple and black. Marialla's parents finished eating and excused themselves, leaving Marialla and Darien alone in the falling night. They spoke of quiet things. Darien found himself speaking of memories long forgotten. When he looked into Marialla's eyes, he thought he saw the reflection of those once lost moments. But when he looked again, he saw only purple and blue blending perfectly into the night. Keith took a seat nearby, a guitar in hand. He strummed absently and then launched into a lilting melody. You know, there was one thing I always liked in the stories. Marialla leaned on the table. What was that? In the stories, there was always dancing. She sighed and looked up into the night. You'd think all they ever did was dance in the Empire. Darien stood, his pulse in his ears. He held his hand out. Oh, let's dance. What's stopping us? Marialla grinned and, stepping around the table, took his hand. Darien resisted the urge to take his hand back and wipe it on his pants. Had his palms always been this sweaty? He felt ridiculous as they stepped into the lantern light, spilling from the doorway. So, she raised an eyebrow, do you actually know how to dance? Darien laughed uncomfortably. Does dancing with my sisters count? Marialla smirked. Let me show you how it's done. She wrapped an arm around Darien and pulled him close. Now just find the music. In the deepening night, with the music of the guitar and the clinking of the dishes in the kitchen to set a rhythm, they danced. Wind howled in the distant ravines, almost mournful. Marialla moved with grace and care, and Darien did his best to keep up. More than once he stepped on her toes, but she only laughed and continued to sweep him along the lines of the music. Her body felt warm against the darkness, and her eyes locked on his. Darien felt dizzy, as though the whole world spun about them. The next day they followed a path that wound like a thread through the orchard. Marialla told him about the apple trees. Like so many other things on Six, they had been genetically engineered. Given a constant supply of water, they would continue to produce fruit all summer. The thick skins of bark surrounded each apple to protect them from the sudden freezes that were all too common in even the warmest summer months. Darien listened quietly. When Marialla spoke, he didn't feel pressure to reply. She took his hand and helped him over the tangled roots of the trees going up the hill. The ordered rows ended at the crest. A sheet of metal, weathered and yet untarnished, lay on its side there. Where it had come from, Darien wondered but did not ask. Some questions were more interesting, unasked and unanswered. It sang beneath their feet, an alien instrument, and went silent when they sat to stare out over the valley. The shattered ruins stretched across an impossible distance. Once they must have swept to the sky in great arcs of metal and glass. Some must have cut the clouds themselves, but they had fallen the furthest. Their remains lay across the city in twisted piles of metal and rock. The shorter buildings, still taller by far than the squat domes people lived in now, remained standing. Cracks ran up their sides, like the ravines that cut across the surface of Six. The windows had grown dark with dirt. Darien couldn't imagine anyone living or working in the structures. Just as Marialla's mother had said, the ruins somehow looked like part of the landscape. Trees, squat and ill-mannered, had even sprouted along the avenues where people and vehicles must have once traveled. I can't believe I'm standing here. Darien spoke more to a version of Kathy in his head than to Marialla. Is it what you hoped it would be? Yes, only... Darien rested his head on his knees and looked to Marialla beside him. Somehow I never dreamed about ruins. It's so lonely. Has anyone ever told you that you're a tad dramatic? Darien chuckled. Only my father, every day of my life. Marialla slugged him in the shoulder. Ouch! Comparing me to your father, that's harsh. Darien reeled from the punch and gave Marialla a look of mock shock. Okay. She held up her hands in surrender. For a few minutes they just sat in companionable silence. It is lonely, she said quietly. She gazed distantly out at the ruins. I think that's why I never liked thinking about it. Darien faced the broken city with all its broken dreams. I just wish I could see it the way my Aunt Kathy, would have seen it. She wouldn't have seen broken teeth and empty streets. She would have seen it the way it once was. I wish I could sit her down next to me. I wish she could tell me all the stories of this city. But she's gone, and I don't think those stories will be told. Not ever. Marialla started at the words and jumped up. Before Darien could ask what was going on, she had her hand around his. She looked down at him with an inscrutable expression. There's something I think you need to see. My family lived here before the city fell. We have records, a book. It may have some of those stories you want. They walked, hand in hand, along the path that threaded through the orchard. In that moment, Darien wondering about an ancient book, and Marialla wondering about the way her pulse pounded when she took Darien's hand, they did not know that someone watched them. The camera, mounted in a crooked pole between the trees, struggled to follow them with groaning servos. A ramp of packed earth wide enough for 2 wagons led down into the underground barn. Patchwork metal doors, scavenged from the ruins, stood open. Inside they found Keith, loading barrels of apples into a wagon. He grunted at them and set down the barrel he had been lifting. Sweat glistened on his face. He wiped it absently with an already damp and grimy sleeve. The shadows of dart mice flitted in the eaves, and horses whinnied from the stalls. Darien walked over and rubbed his horse on the nose. It nipped at his fingers, but he only smiled and pushed it back with a whisper. Marialla grabbed him by the arm and dragged him over to her father. Feeling the heat of her body against his, he thought of winter. What would it be like in bed, snow roaring against the walls, if she lay next to him? How are you two getting on? Keith's voice snapped Darien from his thoughts. He drew back from Marialla with a start, and some sort of sound that he must have meant to be words. Apparently I'm toxic. Yes, Darien shook his head. I just stumbled. Keith chuckled wryly and lifted another barrel up. You didn't bring him down here just to watch him eat his own tongue, I hope. Marialla shot a wicked look at Darien, considering him with her unsettling eyes. He hadn't thought his face could get any warmer, but now he felt feverish. He coughed and looked down at his feet. Why was he looking at his feet? He looked back up and tried to find a safe place for his eyes. Would I do that? She asked her father. Keith raised an eyebrow, lifted one last barrel into the wagon, and swung the tailgate shut. He leaned back against the vehicle and studied them for a moment with a serious expression, but a change came over him when he looked at his daughter. A smile crept onto his face, starting from the eyes and working out, so slowly that Darien didn't notice when it happened. She had cast a magic spell on her father, and Darien felt a sting of jealousy. His father had never smiled at him that way. Okay, you're right. I would bring him here just to see him eat his tongue. But I did have another reason. I know we're busy, but I was hoping I could show him the basement. Why would you want to show him the basement? Well, not the basement. I wanted to show him the family history. Her father nodded. I see. Yes, I suppose he would want to see it. Could I have a quick word with him alone? Marialla raised an eyebrow, but shrugged. So mysterious. Okay, I'll be outside. When his daughter vanished into the daylight, something drained from Keith. He gripped the wagon frame. The smile that had painted his face had completely evaporated. Generations ago, we could use the electric truck for this, but it's gotten too unreliable. We use it here on the orchard, but for anything beyond our borders, it's got to be the wagon. I'll be weeks away on delivery. I may even have to go to the city. But there's something wrong there. Something happening. Darien nodded, but he wondered what the man meant. Darien's father had always hated the city, but that had been as much the instinct of a born misanthrope as anything else. It's hard being away from my family so long. And when it's not me, it's my wife. I've managed not to send Mari yet. The time will come, she's going to have to be the one. And every year we have to travel further and further just to find anyone to trade with. When I was a young man, we hired help, but there's no one left to hire. He paced from stall to stall, ignoring the horse that nosed in his hair. It snorted when he didn't produce any apples for it. Darien stood still, letting Keith find his words. The birds above whispered from rafter to rafter and watched them with wide yellow eyes. At last, Keith stopped pacing. He stood in front of Darien and took him by the shoulders. I keep wondering, how cold will the coming winter be? I'm afraid for Mari. His fingers tightened on Darien's shoulders. I'm afraid about what happens when we're gone and she's alone. This isn't any kind of a world to leave a child. Darien nodded, his mouth dry. I'm not expecting anything from you. It will be her choice in any case, just... I see the way you look at her. You know how special she is, don't you? Yes, Darien spoke in a small voice. Good, good. He slapped Darien on the shoulder and stepped back. At the door to the barn, Keith looked up into the sky. The clouds are thicker than they used to be. The sky is heavier. Darien looked up, but saw the same sky that had always been there. Even with the summer winds rustling the trees in the orchard, it was a cold sky. It held no warmth or comfort. It held only the promise of snow. A door lay in the old forest just beyond the fire trees behind Darien's home. It hid between shadows and roots, buried in a thin layer of dirt. Only the knob, dull green brass, stuck out of the earth. It wasn't a fancy knob. It wasn't carved with dragons and dreams. It wasn't even uniform in shape. It was off-round, as though it had almost been perfect. Still, the moment Darien saw it as a boy, it stopped him in his tracks. He left it that day, still buried. When he returned the next, he knelt beside it. Starting from the knob, he wiped the earth away with his sleeve. It slid from the surface of the door as though it had just been waiting for someone to clear it away. It wasn't a fancy door. It wasn't carved with dragons and dreams. It wasn't even painted a uniform color. Most of it had been painted a pale blue that Darien couldn't place in a world where the sky never changed from gray. For the very bottom was painted a dark blue that reminded him of the depths of the nearby swimming hole. Darien left it that day without trying to move it. In Kathy's stories, doors always led somewhere. They might lead to the bridge of a starship. They might lead to a love long lost. They might lead to a cliff above a roaring sea. They might lead anywhere. He went back to that door day after day. Some days he might grab the handle, all as cold as winter, no matter the weather. Some days he might run his fingers along the edge, feeling the grain of the wood. Some days he only sat in the tree above and stared down into it. He wanted so bad for that door to lead somewhere. He dreamed and dreamed of what might be down there. He dreamed until tears rolled down his face and dripped onto the door. It soaked those tears up. But he had never had the courage to open it. Now Marialla's father led them through the orchard to the skeleton of a house. It had been a large home, something completely different from the domed building where Darien had grown up. He could only imagine what it had once looked like, because all that remained were scorched metal beams. It burned a long time ago, said Keith. He led them to the center of the ruined home, and Darien found himself looking at another door in the ground at his feet. Not a rectangular door leading into the earth. A round airlock hatch with a great wheel. A small window showed only shadows below. Marialla stood on one side and her father on the other. Darien knelt and ran his fingers along the metal. It didn't feel like winter. It felt warm and smooth. He looked up. Marialla smiled down at him. Her father nodded, his face somber. The handle spun, and the door vibrated with a thud as the bolts clicked free. All he had to do was find the courage to pull. He closed his eyes and thought of Kathy. She would never have hesitated. She would have opened the door with a flourish. She would already be down in the darkness, finding the stories in the shadows. He opened the door. The ladder dove into the darkness, and Darien followed. The rungs felt smooth as ice-worn stone beneath his hands. The darkness lay still, and the air silent and heavy, save the sounds of their boots on the ladder. Looking around as he climbed, Darien couldn't see beyond the circle of light flowing down. On the floor, he stepped up to the edge of the light. The darkness looked solid as stone, and the air felt cool as a winter storm against his skin. It smelled of dust, ice, and just a hint of apple. The snap of a match cracked the silence, and a rush of lantern light cut the darkness. Keith stepped forward with the light. It couldn't quite illuminate the ceiling 50 feet above, but it revealed warehouse shelving stretching out in every direction. The shelves held barrels, crates, mechanical parts, and tools, all carefully organized. "There's another opening further into the ruins. I think it was a lift of some sort, but we have a pulley system rigged up to raise and lower stuff. Some of these things have been down here for generations." Keith spoke as he led the way through the shelves. The record book is this way." He gestured with the lantern, sending the shadows skittering and the room lurching with the swaying of the light. Behind them, the ladder looked alone and small, surrounded by black on all sides, with only a small circle of light. Darien peered into the darkness, trying to see what lay ahead, but he may as well have been peering into the great ravine, trying to see the bottom. "How big is this place?" he asked. Keith rubbed his chin. "Bigger than I've seen the end of. There are doors leading into endless hallways and rooms. As far as I can tell, the house above was just a small part of a much larger complex." Keith stopped at a door. It clicked and swung open, smooth and silent. In a small room on the other side, a sagging armchair sat in one corner, and books overflowed from shelf-lined walls. A wooden desk in the center of the room shimmered like polished stone. There were no visible seams in any part of the desk, as though it had been carved from a single massive chunk of wood. Darien's eyes grew wide at the sight of all the books. Almost in a trance, he stepped up to the shelves and started to pull them out at random. The leather covers felt smooth as skin. One after another, he took them out, flipped them open, and mouthed the words. He didn't know where to start or where to stop. A throat sounded, and Darien jumped. He was just able to keep from dropping the book he had been skimming. He blushed as he turned to Marialla and her father. He had all but forgotten they were there. "Someone else who can read," said Keith. "That's unusual out here." Darien shrugged. "My aunt used to teach at the university in the city. Dad never saw much use in it, but he let her teach me. She didn't have many books, but sometimes she would travel to trade them for fresh material." Keith nodded, hung the lantern from a chain in the ceiling, and stepped around to the other side of the desk. He pulled out a key hanging from a fine chain on his neck. The necklace pooled in his palm. He took the key and opened a drawer in the desk. He reached in and pulled out a slim book, just a thin leather cover that shimmered blue and green, with no visible pages in between. Perplexed, Darien leaned forward and examined it. The outline of an embossed golden bird, wings stretched open in flight, graced the cover. "It's just a cover. What happened to the book?" Marialla smiled and winked. "So little faith. One would only think we'd met yesterday." Darien raised an eyebrow. "We did meet yesterday." "Well, yes, I suppose that's true. Nonetheless, trust me, this is worth seeing." Keith handed the cover to Darien, who took it with great care. It felt solid and strangely heavy in his hands. He looked up to Keith and then to Marialla, a question on his face. "Go on, open it already," she said. With a shrug, Darien flipped back the front cover and found a single page. Flowing, handwritten script, every word a swirling swoop of rich black ink, lay in the center of the perfectly smooth white page. Darien couldn't detect even the slightest imperfection in the pulp of the paper, or any sign at all of the yellowing that had aged every book he'd ever read. "Confessions," Darien read out loud, "from the fall of the Empire." His mouth went dry, and he swayed on his feet. "The fall of the Empire? You can't be telling me this is 497 years old." Keith studied him, his eyes shining. "I could hardly believe it myself when I married Alani and she showed me this place, but I believe it to be true. Touch the paper." Darien reached down to do as he'd been told, and then hesitated. It looked so perfect, so beautiful, and he knew that the oils on his skin would only hasten its aging. Marialla groaned. "Just do it already! Trust me, you'll want to see this." Darien touched the page, and at once the script smoothed away, to be replaced by a page filled with words. He gasped, fumbled the book, and had to catch it awkwardly against his body to keep from throwing it on the floor. "What in the palace am I holding?" "It's some form of technology, although how it works I can't fathom. I know there are computers in the city, slim tablets in some way similar to the book you hold. Maybe your aunt would have seen them. I believe they're held by the university." Darien didn't know if she had. Kathy had come back from the city with stories upon stories, and some books, but she hadn't said much about what she had seen or done there. When Darien asked, she only shrugged and waved him off. "That place is little more than a gravestone," she said to him once. "It may be worth you going there to see it someday, and you may well learn something when you do, but it isn't a living place. It's a monument to what once was." "Well, those apples won't load themselves. I'd best get back to work." Let me help," said Darien. "I don't mind the work." Keith smiled and shook his head. "There's always more work. It isn't going anywhere. Take some time. Read the book." He took another lantern from a shelf by the door, lit it, and stepped into the warehouse. Marialla shivered, and Darien felt a pang of guilt. "We don't have to stay down here. I would understand if you told me you wanted to leave." Marialla met his gaze with those disconcerting eyes. Darien had to steady himself with a hand on the desk. When he looked into her eyes, he saw something there, the way he had seen Tom's daughter in the mirror. But it wasn't one thing, one person, or one time. He saw an entire future when her eyes met his. But it was like no future he'd ever imagined for himself, and he couldn't make out any of the details. Instead, he felt it as heavy and still as someplace lost and dark and untouched. "You know what I thought when I met you?" Marialla eased down into the chair in the corner. Darien shook his head, transfixed. "I thought you seemed like someone searching for something you knew you'd never find. Sit down." She motioned to a smaller chair behind the desk. "Read already. I know you want to." Darien felt a longing as he stared down at Marialla. He wanted to take her face in his hands, to feel her skin as smooth as the cover of a book, to lean down like a character in a story and kiss her. In that moment, he understood the future he saw in her eyes. It was that life his father had dreamed for him, the quiet life he'd never wanted a day in his life. He shook his head, and the spell broke, and her eyes were just eyes, beautiful but not magical. They burned the temple today and toppled what survived the fire. They tore it to pieces, like animals devouring a carcass. A month ago, they would have gathered here for weddings. They would have come for guidance. They would have worshipped the palace and given it their thanks. Even now, no one has the courage to disturb the reflecting pool. It's the only thing left, somehow untouched and unblemished. Not so much as a pebble rippled the surface when the pillars fell. I stood on the steps and watched the fire burn. The mob tried to pull the columns down with their bare hands, till some palace-cursed man thought to pull them down with winches. Then, when there was nothing left to burn or break, they gathered the priests. They beat them to death right there on the steps. It's all I could do to stand back and let it happen. I swore an oath to protect the innocent. I swore it for her. For her. But I'm done with all that now. See where it got me, where it got all of us, where it got everything? No. That oath was righteous, but I'm not. I'm not. Darien followed the words, his heart lurching in his chest. He tasted the smoke on the air. He smelled the metallic tang of blood. Kathy had told him that when Greywind exploded and destroyed Leviathan, that the Empire had broken into chaos. Who could have faith in a broken god? But the words in this magic book took Darien's breath away. They had been written by someone who had seen it all happen. Marialla leaned over his shoulder to see what he was reading. Her hair tickled his face, and he found himself quietly laughing. "Oh yes, I can see why you find this passage funny." She elbowed him in the ribs and leaned back in her chair with a yawn. Flip ahead a few pages to where he's watching his daughter running through the fields. Read it to me. I like that part. Darien tapped his finger on the book until he found the section that Marialla had mentioned. I stood at the door today and watched Donnie running through the field. The sun's last warmth hung in the air, but already stars clung to the sky between the clouds. Darien's voice hitched here. Had the stars once been visible? She was just a shadow, her black hair the night wind behind her. She leapt up at me and reached her small arms around my neck. She smelled of grass and dew, of shadows and dusk. I wish I could have held her forever. Darien took a deep breath and looked up. Behind him, Marialla's breath came in the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He watched her for a brief moment, and then set the book down on the desk, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. He fell asleep in the midst of wondering who this man had been, this man who had written of oaths and priests. Darien dreamed a quiet dream of quiet moments, but the page remained open on the book. The book couldn't speak, but the written words had a voice. It was a voice that could only be heard by the shadows that had lain here in this room for so long. I wish I could have held her forever, but she smelled just like her mother, and just like her mother, I knew I would lose her someday. Some things you just know. Some things are preordained in the Palace of Mirrors, and nothing you do can change those reflections. So I breathed deep and held her close, and let the night wind wash over us both. I breathed deep and hid my tears in her hair. She doesn't understand why I cry so often. She doesn't understand. Everything I've done, she's the only good thing. She's the only thing that matters. Rain drummed against the house and beat it on the windows. It rolled along the glass in twisting paths. Darien stood in the open doorway, watched the storm, and thought of Tom. He wondered if his friend had made it to his brother. He hoped so. He hoped Tom sat with family beside a warm stove. He hoped the sound of the rain brought the man good memories of those he had lost. But then again, Darien often found that the good memories cut the deepest. Even the little light that made it through the storm felt like an ocean of light after sitting in the office underground. Wind slipped around him into the open house, whispering all the way. It carried a chill, but Darien hardly noticed as it breathed past him. "Are you looking to invite the rain inside?" asked Marialla's mother. Darien smiled sheepishly and shut the door. "Sorry, I was lost in thought." Alani stepped up beside him and stared out the window in the door. The panes of glass rattled in a sudden gust of wind. She pursed her lips and Darien felt her studying him from the corner of her eye. He realized that just along the edges, they shared streaks of purple with Marialla. "My husband likes you." The glass fogged with her breath. "What about you? Do you like me?" She turned and looked him straight in the eye. "You're a good man, I can see that," she spoke in a level voice. "But you're a dreamer, and I'm afraid this is no world for dreamers. My husband tosses and turns at night, worrying about Mari. He doesn't know what to do, because once we're gone, she'll be alone. There's no community, not the way there once was." A bolt of lightning flashed against the clouds, and thunder rattled the door. Darien shivered and thought of all the empty homes he'd seen. Some of them had been all but swallowed by the blowing dust of the barren fields. Alani closed her eyes and shook her head. "He thinks maybe you two can save one another, and at first I thought he was letting his fear blind him to your weakness." Darien had to fight to keep from flinching at the words. You said at first. Does that mean you've changed your mind?" Her lips tightened. Outside the rain had begun to thin, and the wind had died down. The apple trees grew limp, water dripping from their leaves. "I've lost count of the storms I've seen," she rubbed her arms. "I feel them deep in my bones now, but I remember a time when they hadn't worked their way so far into me. Maybe you can protect her from that. Maybe when the storms shake the walls, your dreams could be what she needs. Maybe someone rooted in the earth is trapped there and can't change when the world calls for it. I've almost forgotten what it feels like to change. Most days I feel like I've always been the woman I am now." She held out her knotted, calloused hands and turned them slowly. "I've begun to believe nothing will ever change. But when it rains, I feel that ache in the heart of my bones, and I know things do change. I know that I've changed, and that my Mari will change as well." She laughed, quiet and almost bitter. "Maybe I'm being foolish. Maybe nothing can stop the cold from getting inside. Not here, not beneath these clouds. Still, if there's any chance I can spare her from that I can give her a better life, a life that isn't just cold wind. If there's any chance, I think maybe it's you." Darien met her eyes. They were cold eyes, but they weren't brittle. "I'll keep her safe," said Darien. "I promise." Alani smiled, but her smile had an edge of ice to it. "Can a promise turn aside the winter winds? Can a promise stop the snow falling? Can a promise stop a mother dying in childbirth?" She spoke quietly, as though to herself, gave Darien's shoulder a squeeze, and left him standing alone beside the door. The front door slammed open in the middle of the night, and the shrieking wind forced its way into the living room. Clothes hanging over the cast-iron wood stove flailed, and a cup that had been left on the edge of the table toppled and spilled cider across the floor. In the dark, it looked like freshly fallen blood. Paintings and pictures rattled on the walls, and a half-knitted blanket flew across the room, needles clattering like bones. Darien started up from his cot beside the stove, and he could only think of the night Tom had arrived at their door. He woke shivering, not from the cold, but from the fear that gripped his heart. He expected pirates, with the eyes of monsters, and swords sharp enough to separate a man from his life. Instead, soldiers in black body armor stood in the door like shadows brought to life. Behind them, the sun had just begun to tinge the clouds with color and light. Trees swayed with the remnants of the last night's storm. 2 soldiers took up posts at the door, while another 5 entered the home. They ignored Darien, frozen with shock in his bed. Somewhere, deep down, he knew he needed to take action, but his body remained as rooted as the trees. 2 of the soldiers cracked needlessly through one of the thin bedroom doors. Splinters twisted and tumbled on the wind, raking Darien's face. He gasped and shielded his eyes, while the soldiers dragged Marialla's parents out of their room. The other two shattered the door to Marialla's room with heavy boots. Marialla growled in protest when the soldiers dragged her kicking and punching across the room. She landed a punch and gave one of her captors a fat, bloody lip. With a savage scream, they kicked Marialla in the side. She cried out and went limp. "Stop it!" yelled one of the men who remained in the main room. "Remember your orders. She's not to be harmed." "Mari!" Her father struggled, but the soldier holding him did not budge. "No! Please, no! Take anything we have, just don't take her! We have plenty. Please, I beg you, by the Palace of Mirrors, don't take my daughter!" Ilani did not beg, but tears ran silently down her face. She stood tall, and though a soldier held her wrists, she seemed free. Her hair whipped in the frenzy of the wind, and her tears rained across the room. They stung worse than the splinters when they hit Darien's face. His fist closed around cold iron. The soldiers had Marialla out the door and began to drag her struggling body through the mud into the orchard. Time froze, and Darien felt as though they had all been painted onto the world. His fingers tightened around the fire iron until they had gone numb. Still, the moment stretched on and on until it broke. The soldier who had spoken earlier made a motion with his hand. "They have her at the extraction point. Fall back." What about them?" asked the woman holding Marialla's father. "We don't need them. His Majesty only wants the girl." He paused, and the howling wind filled the silence. "Kill them." With that, the leader stepped out the door and followed the two who had taken Marialla. Keith's eyes widened, and he twisted free. He punched the woman who had been holding him. Blood splattered out as her nose broke with a crunch. She splayed out on the ground, and Keith turned for the door. He made it one step, and then another, and then the explosion of a gun sucked all the sound from the room. Keith staggered back and looked down at the gaping hole in his chest. He reached for the wound, as though to hold himself together, but his hands never made it. His eyes had emptied out before he hit the floor with a wet thud. Ilani took a deep breath. Her tears had stopped, and the look on her face was as hard as any Darien had ever seen. It was stone that had weathered winters beyond counting. She met his eyes, and in that moment they were a perfect shade of purple, deep and haunting. "Remember your—" A bullet punched her to her knees. But even with blood on her lips, she did not fall. She kept her eyes on Darien, and a whisper rattled from her lips. "Your promise." She collapsed. The sound she made when she hit the ground did not seem like the sound a human body should make. It sounded heavy and lifeless and completely unlike the woman who had made it. Another strange sound filled the room. It took Darien a moment to realize it came from him. It held all the grief and rage that had wound around him since the day Kathy died on that early winter night. He bolted, iron poker held high. The soldier who had killed Ilani didn't have time to turn their gun on Darien. The iron poker cracked against their arm, and the gun splashed down into the pool of blood spreading out from Marialla's mother. Darien snatched the gun off the floor and rolled awkwardly across the room. Another boom, and the wall exploded behind him in a spray of wood and plaster. He swung his pistol around, remembering the target practice his father had insisted upon, and fired. The woman with a broken nose flew backward and slid across the now slippery floor. Darien turned to face the two men at the door. It felt as though an eternity had passed since Ilani hit the floor, but from the shocked expressions on the soldiers' faces, it had only been an instant. Had only been enough time for 2 shots to count down the time. Twin booms filled the next instant. Darien's bullet sent one of the 2 soldiers rolling out into the mud. The other bullet struck Darien's arm. The impact reverberated through his entire body, and he staggered. Just keeping his balance, He turned his gun on the final soldier. His vision doubled, and the shot passed harmlessly over the soldier's shoulder. They stared at one another, guns pointed. Darien knew he wouldn't win this standoff, but he did not let himself flinch. He wouldn't give the man the satisfaction. The soldier surveyed the room, licked his lips, and then dove out the door and around the corner so that Darien no longer had a shot. Just as Darien went to follow, he heard a growl from behind him. The soldier whose arm he had broken had climbed to her feet. She dove at him in a tackle that he just managed to dodge. With a groan, Darien fired the gun, and the soldier went still. The door to the home swung wildly on the wind. Boom! 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 It seemed to echo the violence that had filled the house. Darien held a hand to his bleeding arm. It should hurt. He knew it should hurt, but instead it just felt numb. Shock, some distant voice whispered. Marialla's parents lay splayed out on the ground in unnatural positions. Their blood mingled with the blood of their killers on the floor. Darien closed his eyes. On the other side of his lids, he saw the eyes of those he had killed. Tears clung to the corners of his eyes, but they didn't fall. Other images lay behind his eyes. Marialla in the lamplight, asleep in the chair beside Darien. Their bodies moving together to music in the evening. Alani's tears on his face, and her last whispered plea. Swaying, Darien burst out of the open door. The last soldier threaded through the orchard toward the hilltop where Darien and Marialla had looked out over the ruined city. Darien took in a shuddering gasp of biting cold air. Blood dripping from his fingers, he charged up after the man. He couldn't let them take Marialla. No matter what it took, he would get her back. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please rate and review. It really helps out a lot. This was a big episode and took a bit longer to make than I expected, but I'm going to try to keep to my regular schedule from now on. Next week, on Palace of Mirrors. On the knife's edge between life and death, Darien finds help in an unexpected place.